Well, we're delighted to be meeting you today and having this roundtable. Our group of Democratic Socialists of America in France, DSA in France, which is not quite a year old yet, has had the ambition of putting on a series of public forums on issues of importance to activists and to anyone interested in tuning in. There was one earlier such discussion that we had about 2 months ago on the French security law, La Loi de Sécurité Globale. And today's subject belongs to the category of ongoing political education. It's a fundamental one, it's a vexed one, a troubled one, almost by definition. We all agreed on the importance of a discussion on race today because we always need more clarity. Here is how we've planned things for tonight, or this afternoon, depending on where you are. We have a set of questions which all 4 invitees have received and have had some time to think about. I'm going to present these same questions now so that we can all have a focus on them and have a real discussion. These are basically 3 questions. One about France, one about the United States, and one about what it means to be comparing and contrasting these 2 national experiences and relating them to each other. Once all 4 people have spoken, we will go on with all our remaining time into question and answer mode. The questions that you who are listening or watching send in via Facebook will be gathered by Flo, to whom we give great thanks for putting on this event. No doubt, subject to some selection, perhaps for reasons of time, depending on how many questions flow into us here, and transmitted to Camille and myself, who are co-moderating the event. They will be presented in batches of 4 and 5 questions that any of the 4 speakers will be invited to tackle. Some of the questions may, of course, be more directed to the US people and some questions more to the French people, and some may be of a more general nature. We'll sort it out, of course. So the whole thing is scheduled to last about an hour and a half. Perhaps, possibly we can exceed that a tiny bit, but not too much. So let me jump right in now with the first question for the French folks. But before we do that, Camille and I are going to present the 4 invitees more or less in the order that you'll be watching them and hearing them. We'll start with Danièle Obono, who was born in Gabon and since 2017 has been a member of the French National Assembly for France's 17th parliamentary district, and Paris's 17th parliamentary district, which covers parts of the 18th and 19th arrondissement or districts of northeastern Paris, as a member of La France Insoumise, a party whose name could possibly be translated as, we were talking about this before, the France Unsubdued, or France Rebellious, or France Standing Up. There are various ways of translating it. A party created, I think, around 2017 or so, or slightly before. She belongs to various parliamentary commissions, including a special commission on bioethics and a commission on European affairs, and a parliamentary study group on discrimination and LGBTQI phobia in the world, and is co-author with Caroline Fiat, another Insoumise deputy in the National Assembly, of the book Insoumise à l'Assemblée, published by La Dispute Editions in 2018. All right. So we're going to begin with you, Danièle. Thanks again so much for being with us. We have agreed to speak English for the event, and thank you for making that effort because we have an audience which presumably goes beyond the hexagon today. For many reasons, it seemed to us that you would be a very helpful panelist today to help us understand the French situation in general. The questions regarding race are not necessarily what brought you into politics originally. You work on many other issues, including lots of questions of economic justice, sustainable development on a national scale, on an international scale as well. But for various reasons, maybe in spite of yourself, you've been drawn into lots of discussions about race and racism, and you've not shied away from those discussions. So here is the question that I've already put to you in shorter form. And for the public, I'm going to draw it out a little bit to help maybe give some structure to the discussion. This question is about France and its experience in all these matters that in the US we call matters of race. Although in France, the very term race has been more and more banished from mainstream political language, as if to name it were to make it exist, or as if by not naming it, you could make it disappear. So the general question is, what's going on in France? Some of us have been here for quite a while and others for less time, but we still sometimes have trouble figuring it out. What we see is lots of polarization in general, a center-right bloc in power that is now getting harder and harder to distinguish from the far right in many ways, and a divided political left, referring mostly to socialists, communists, Greens of various tendencies, and les insoumis. Now, part of this division obviously has to do with very classic quarrels within the left over questions of political economy, what kind of transition, what reference, if any, to socialism, those kinds of questions. And also over Europe and what it means to belong to the European Union. That's another major source of real disagreement within the French left. But the question begins this way. Couldn't we also say that those questions that we refer to as having to do with race are also a major factor of disagreement on the left? Or maybe we could frame this just as well under the label of identity. There's lots of troubled discussions even within the left, a lot of denial, not just on the right, but among groups identified with the left regarding race and racism and whether or not even to talk about it, much less to do anything about it. So you have a portion of the left that wants to refer only to social and economic issues, to class and not to race, because that's considered too divisive and likely to stimulate more racism. Of course, it's obviously not only in France that you hear this, but in France, this message is reinforced by a whole discourse of republicanism. That is the idea that being a citizen of the Republic requires you to leave aside your identifications with ethnic or religious groups and just be a citizen in the abstract, which means no reference to ethnicity or religion or color or anything of that sort in public life, because that's false consciousness, that's division, that's something that is mysteriously referred to in French as communautarisme, which is a very strange pseudo concept which has no translation into any other language. The communautarisme. We can talk about this perhaps. I think I've already had this discussion before with Philippe Marlière. There is a closely related phenomenon of denial specifically regarding Islamophobia. The notion of laïcité, the French Republican version of secularism, has been, you might say, hijacked, détourné, and turned into a weapon against Islam by defining Islam as a religion that is incompatible with laïcité. And laïcité is supposed to stand for the neutrality of the state with respect to all religions, but when you weaponize it against one religion, it becomes something else, right? And then there's a lot of nonsense about Islamophobia not even existing and simply being a diabolical invention of some Iranians somewhere. At the same time, if you're on the right, anywhere on the right, then and you really want to insult the left, then you call it the Islamo-left, right? And you suggest that these Islamo-leftists, Islamo-gauchistes, are useful idiots who are helping Islamic fanatics to take France over little by little, the enemy within. So that's where we are today. I mean, in short, anytime that anti-racism tries to assert itself, whether it be to propose measures against discrimination or, let's say to defend mothers who wear a veil and want to attend school outings with their children, anti-racists are accused of defending special interests, particularist communities, or contributing to a discourse of victimhood, or worse, contributing to the undermining of the French nation or its submission to a foreign influence, since Islam is defined by some, by too many, as foreign by definition. So the main question is there a way out of this? Can the left in France find some way of uniting in spite of all these misunderstandings over race, over laïcité, over Islam that polarize the whole political landscape, including within the left? This situation looks rather difficult, but maybe there are some struggles that can help the French left get beyond this. So I was wondering if you'd kindly share with us how you see this. Both of you, starting with Danièle.
Okay, thank you very much, DSA friends, for inviting me to this conversation, for organizing this conversation. I think it's very useful to share experience and to discuss our strategy, because we are, first of all, political activists, and our common goal is to get a majority of the people fight for our rights, but also for an horizon of emancipation for all. And I think I truly believe that can't be achieved in only one country. It is a very internationalist fight. So this is part of this movement, internationalist movement, and building strength by sharing our experience. So thank you very much for this. First of all, I'm going to start maybe by explaining who I am and from where I'm talking, because I think it's always important to really explain it. And I'm not sure I will give you all the answers about this, the situation, or the key that can resolve them. But hopefully, sharing my perspective can help the conversation going and can help us find together ideas and how to fight back. So who am I? I'm actually member of the parliament. I mean, it's the first time I've been elected in 2017. And I've been an activist for most of my adult life and involved in all sorts of movements. As you said, I've been involved in politics first through the anti-globalization movement, actually, which is why also internationalism is very important to me, through the big gathering in the early 2000s against WTO, against the EU neoliberal agenda. I've been part of those wonderful movements with the European Social Forum in Genoa in 2001, which was very emotional experience because of the death of Carlo Giuliani at the time. So this is the movement I've been part since I began to get involved into politics. And I usually say that I became Black as a political identity through being an activist, because most of the time, most of my actually political experience in France, I've been one of the only Black women, young. I'm not so young anymore, but when I started getting involved, I was quite of an oddity, something which was very uncommon on the left, even on the radical left, because sociologically, the radical left in France is mostly middle class, white, male, also, and but to me, it didn't struck me until I get confronted inside my organization to micro aggression of racism, and especially when young activists from popular background and from Muslim cultural background got involved into politics and wanted to be part of the left movement, and basically got expelled from our left movement, our radical movement, the movement I was part of. And I started to realize that for most of the people around me who actually accepted me into the movement, because I talk right, I went to school, I was good at school, so I had no except from being Black, I had no other stigma that people of color in French people of color usually have. Maybe also because I wasn't born in France and I wasn't raised in France most of my life, so I had this perspective, and but I wasn't seen as Black, or I wasn't seen as my political identity as Black was erased for most of these people. And then I encountered this Islamophobia inside the movement when those young activists have been building, in this in the grassroots movements, and who've been extraordinary in what they've been doing in the movement, got finally expelled, not formally, but they left the movement because of the backlash, especially, and it's centered around a young woman wearing a hijab. Her name was Ilan Musaid, and she was denied the right to be part of the movement and represent the movement during an electoral process. And this experience really, to me, was very was violent for them, of course, and was also because I was like a witness of that, and we fight back, and we stood, some of us, a minority of us, stood in solidarity with those young comrades. But but we were in the minority. So this is, of course, there are all other things. I will sum up and try to get to the point, but I think it was important to understand where I come from and politically how I got aware of the depth of the race problem inside the left, inside the radical left. I'm not even talking about the institutional left. That was a radical, small radical organization I'm talking about. So that's been part of my political experience. That's also been part of what made me an anti-racist activist, and I've been involved in the movement before that, of course. But that was really a turning point for me. And what I also encountered, it's beyond the color blindness of French, and I think we'll talk about it, French, political ideals and all that thing. What also struck me is that there was an erasure of the history of people of color, of revolutionary people of color, of beyond the few references here and there. We knew more about 18th or 19th century Russia than we knew about French WNCD's revolutionary history. And I think that's also part of, so that you understand the ideological background, even of the French left, is that there is this blank, even for activists and radical and revolutionary, we don't know our own history. And if you want to know your own history, especially if you are a person of color, you have to fight against your own organization to go and find things and usually find references, find theories in the US, with the US movements of civil rights movement. And then from the US, you learn about the French West Indies, and you learn about your own history by, going outside your immediate political environment. So I'll stop here. We can go back to that if you want more, just so that you understand some of the experience, what you experience when you get involved, as I've been into radical politics in the early 2000s. And yet here I am, and I'm part of what is seen on the left as, not so left, because we are a movement that want to gain power, that want to be in power in a society that, as you said, is rife with polarization, and a very, very dangerous polarization. And I think with the Macron regime, we went even further than before. What I've been talking about and what you really aptly describe is not new. It's not unique to France, actually. In the history of emancipation, in the history of the class struggle, there've always been debates about identity, and about women fighting for their rights, enslaved people fighting to be free, colonized people fighting to get liberation, and within the movement. So I think it's also important to remind us of that this is not new. What is very striking in France is sometimes we feel like it never existed before, which is a way also to erase all the history of the French Black and brown people who've been fighting to get liberated for their own liberation, whether within the colonies at the times or even within, metropolitan France. So there's this erasure of history, of our own history. And also, there is, I think, the idea of the working class in France is still shaped with a very orthodox view of, the white working class, the rank and file, communist style workers, which actually never existed per se. They've always been people of color. They've always been women, even. But I think there's this ideological idea. So the idea is that to unite the working class, you have just to talk about, social economical matters and nothing else, unless because it will distract us from the goal. And also, I think it's very it's not new to the conversation. And we could talk about the brilliant letter from Aimé Césaire in the 50s and 60s, when he resigned from the Communist Party, and when he said, actually, and he denounced the color blindness and the paternalism and the contempt in which even the Communist Party, who talk about liberation, actually erased people of color. And it's brilliant. It's a brilliant letter that we usually refer, and it gives you an idea that alpha 50 years later, half a century later, we're still dealing with those issues. And yeah, so I'm sorry, I've been focusing a lot about history and context, because I think it's important to have this conversation, not like it's something unique or that we don't know. We actually do know about it, and we know also what we need or already to go beyond. And the first thing is to listen to the people who are targeted by the right and the state, who are stigmatized, who are harassed. That's the people, and talk about Islamophobia, for instance, like Muslim people, and stand by their side and fight along them, and find common. And there are many common fight we can have together. And I think so. And then to finish, I know I've been quite taking some time, but I think so. What we're seeing now happening in France is a political, social, and economic and cultural backlash from the system itself. From when you think about Macron, who presented himself as this modern leader, cosmopolitan, and neither on the right nor on the left, but both of them, he really embodies to me the system and the status quo. And what we saw is facing with working class struggle, facing with opposition movements, he just revealed himself to be deeply, as he said, not so center-right, but really right and even far-right. And so I think it's important to understand, because we've known far-right for a long time in France. It's not something new. What is new is that now the discourses, but also the politics and the legislation of the far-right are being put into practice, into existence by the government and the power. And I think what I mostly object when we talk about it, I think it's important to remind us of the political strategy of the government and of the regime. But usually what is said on the left is that they are using racism or xenophobia in order to distract from the social struggle, which I think is a flawed analysis. It's not part of the diversion. I think it's part of their political and ideological worldview. That is how they view. And I think it's important to racism is not a diversion. Racism is something real that has an impact on the people being targeted, an economic and social and cultural and psychological impact. Racism kills people, and racism is part of an ideological worldview that abstain, the status quo, the hierarchy of the capitalist system. So it's something not by default, but an actual positive for them for the right. It's something positive that can unite their own electoral base. And what we're seeing in France now is Macron deciding to build an electoral base, a right and a far right electoral base, and racism is part of this thing uniting them. And why are we weak? Why is the left weak? And I'm going to stop there. Why is the left weak? Is because of what I've said before, is like the denial and the erasure of our own history, of this multicultural working class history. And also because part of what used to be considered left actually joined the reaction, joined the right, joined Macron's relied on the Socialist Party cadre and leaders in order to take power. So you got this part of the left and part of the most aggressive people against, targeting activists and targeting Muslim people are from the so-called left. And I think what's happening and been weakening is this ideological adhesion, the fact that the part of the Socialist Party and its leadership actually joined the backlash, and because of neoliberalism and the fact that they lost the emancipation and revolutionary ideals that used to be part of the left, they just abandoned it and joined the idea of free market and blah 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 blah. So I think that's my analysis of the situation right now. So I'm stopping now. Sorry for
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm going to now pass it to Camille. We were actually planning before, which I forgot to do, to present all of our invited guests today before then going on to Philippe. So Camille, would you please present Philippe to begin with, and we'll. That's what we were supposed to do, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, all yours.
So yeah, hello. We also have Philippe Marlière with us. Philippe is a professor of French and European politics at University College London, where he's lived since the 90s. He researches and writes on the French left, laïcité, and race relations in France, as well as French party politics. And he's currently working on a book, which is a critique of the French Republican ideology. He has published prolifically on the subject. Welcome, Philippe. Thank you so much for being here with us and having this discussion. Should we go ahead and introduce everyone else?
Yeah, I think that would be a nice thing to do. So because people have made the effort to be with us, we go on to Nichole.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hello, Nichole. So we have Nichole Mossalam, who's an activist and interfaith leader in Massachusetts, a member of the Boston DSA and the Massachusetts Democratic Party State Committee. She is the founding director of the Islamic Cultural Center in Medford. Welcome, Nichole, from across the pond, if you will. We're really happy to have you with us.
Okay. Is my mic still on? Yes, it is. And our the fourth person you'll be hearing from is Asad Haider, who is founding editor of Viewpoint magazine and the author of a book which attracted the attention of several of us in the group here, a book entitled Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump, Verso Books 2018. His writing can be found in The Baffler, N+1, The Point, Salon, and elsewhere. And just to go a little bit further, Viewpoint magazine is a magazine that some of you might want to look up. I just did recently. It describes itself as follows. It aims to understand the struggles that define our conjuncture, critically reconstruct radical history, and reinvent Marxism for our time. Viewpoint is therefore neither a socialist news source nor an academic journal. It is a militant research collective. You can find it online at viewpointmag.com. A bit of a plug here, but thought it was important. All right. And now we will hear from Philippe, also on France.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, Jim, Camille, and also Florian, who's been doing the technical setup. Very happy to speak to American friends from the DSA. And I'm also happy to meet again my once comrade in NPA and Ensemble, Danièle. Hi. Well, I'd like to make 2 points about this issue of, you call that, Jim, you said matters of race in the USA. I don't know how the French call it, by the way, because they try to avoid discussing the notion of race altogether, as much as they can. And when I say the French, it's a very vague way of putting it, but it's intentional in a way. I think there's very little appetite in point is to try to, of course, in a nutshell, that's a bit of a simplification, to explain why historically it's been, why the French don't want to speak about race and can't also in a way, because not wanting is really intentional, whereas in a sense there's a bit also of they don't know how to do it. And I would use the word they're illiterate when it comes to race. They can't discuss it because it's not part of the culture, it's not part of their education, it's not part of their upbringing. Of course, it helps if around you, you have institutions, schools, political parties, unions, family discussions, chats with friends where, you know, certain notions of, you know, can come up in support of anti-racist discussions and policies, which I think are largely missing. The second point is slightly to nuance the first point, which is, in fact, France, in my opinion, has just started to discuss race now. But I'll try to make sense. Why is it now? Well, I say now, not today, of course, but I think probably dates back the probably around the election of Macron. Something happened there, and I would like to explain why. So I think the first point I said, in my view, and I'm a Frenchman, so I can be so abrupt, the French are illiterate about race, clearly. And I think I've been living in the UK, where there's also, of course, like in any society, racism, racial prejudices, but I think it's nowhere near what, I mean, the depth of ignorance that you find in France. People are much more in the media, in politics, in the universities, much more aware of those issues, discuss them, engage with them. There are anti-racist policies and things that you wouldn't even think of in France today. I think you partly gave the answer, Jim, earlier, which is France has a nice way, a fantastic way of avoiding any substantial, significant discussion on race, because it has a narrative which unites the whole nation, which is the Republican one. And you kindly, Camille, mentioned I was working on a book, which is exactly, I'm going to tackle that. It's a narrative, it's an ideology, which is, you know, France has, since the revolution, has a sort of shown the light to the world in a direction to take with its universal values, positing that all human beings, when they're born, are equal. So giving you sort of granting rights to people according to the constitution, according to the laws, makes people indeed equal. And of course, racism, there can't be such thing in French society as sort of racial discrimination, because in theory people are equal, and it's only, you know, you have to find that and catch the racists, those who are blatantly racist. Those are the guys, the bad guys. They are, of course, and people will acknowledge that they are bad guys, they are racist, but they are those really rotter, those horrible racist things. But of course, I see you all smiling, of course, because that's not the way it works. Most of the time, true racists, of course, are not blatantly racist. And there's a lot of racial discrimination going on without a lot of us being aware of it. You know, it's so, and this is really the sort of the thing which is totally hidden in French society, and an inability of, again, the media, the political class in general, the government, to really sit down and address that, and even acknowledge that there is such thing. France is colorblind. I think it's Danièle who used the word. Yes, it means that what makes a French citizen is not its ethnic background, its race, its philosophy, its religion, but it's being part of the French community, and also in return duties that you owe the community. Believe me, that kind of thing, of course, it's a bit of a summary, but a lot of people believe in that, including on the left. And this is where the problem starts, with the left being unable to address the question of race and racism in its true sense, not the blatant bad guy racist, but racial discrimination, which are not, which you can't really capture sort of because they're not blatant. So this is part of the problem, this sort of thing. And historically, that was part of this Republican narrative. The trouble is the left is Republican in the French sense, not Republican in the US sense, of course, which is, of course, a very noble thing. You know, the French Republicanism stems from the French Revolution, Enlightenment ideas, and as such, if you are a progressive person, if you are even very much on the left, it's very hard to be against that. And but I think that's come to the point that today it is the problem. And I very isolated, I have to say, and I no longer live in France. Of course, very few people will listen to me, but I suggest from time to my French comrades on the left, probably to refer and to mention, to discuss a little bit less republicanism, laïcité, we'll come to it later, and this freedoms, democracy, it's not abstract rights, abstract been totally hijacked by the whole political spectrum, even to the point that historically the far right, which opposed all the time the Republic and laïcité, is now more Republican and more laïc than the rest of the political class. So there is a problem there. The left doesn't seem to be able to cope with this. Keep banging on with this laïcité and republicanism thing, which, as I said, have become, in my view, very toxic terms. Not that they are as such toxic, don't get me wrong, but they've become toxic by their use, the way they are used now, which means, in a sense, laïcité and republicanism now are, in a nutshell, a way to decline implicitly a sort of a new type of French nationalism, a new type of Frenchness, whereby all people living in France, French citizens notably, even those who are not French, have to abide by certain rules and laws, fair enough, but also certain, I should say, adopt a certain type of behavior, certain cultural traits and aspects. That's why the hijab, for instance, becomes such a prominent issue in France. A lot of people, in the name of republicanism and laïcité, will argue that, in my view, very wrongly, will argue that it isn't French to wear hijab in a public space, for instance, you see. So that's really how now a notion which historically has been associated with the left has now shifted to the right, to the point that it's become really meaningless if you are progressive, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, whatever, to sort of say I'm also a Republican. It's become really, really toxic. So that was my first point. The second point: why now, despite all this sort of difficulty to discuss race and therefore really make sense of racism, the way it works, and not simply racism as an outright act of a blatant act of racism. I think 2017, what happened, as you know, Macron was elected out of the blue, new leader, unknown. He didn't even have a party, and Macron's election really was really a kind of major political earthquake in French politics, in the sense that the old divide, left and right, was essentially a major social democratic party, Parti Socialist, and a main conservative party, Les Républicains. All that exploded. And you see the state they're in now, a complete disarray. Socialist Party, I don't think will make a comeback. It's dead. It will remain now a very marginal force. Républicains not doing well. Macron has done that. Why? Because clearly he's taken with him part of the socialist electorate, the sort of more moderate fraction, and he's also taken with him a part of the conservative electorate. So that's what he's done, except that by governing, he's shifted to the right. It's now, everyone will agree here that Macron is not a centrist. He's really shifted to the right, his economic policies, but also his stand on cultural issues, notably on laïcité, notably adopting the Republican narrative, but the right-wing one, the one which is toxified now, and which the left should be very careful not to use, in my opinion, or to use with great care. So he's done that. His gamble is that he wants to be reelected in a year's time by having as major opponent Le Pen, far right. He doesn't want anyone on mainstream right, nor on the left, someone like Mélenchon, for instance. So he's gambling on really having the far right. How does he do that? And this is part of the explanation why we're talking more about race suddenly in France. It's been imported from the US, and it's quite a bit of a paradox and ironic, given that there's been lots of talks about Islamo-leftism and the importation from the US of the Americanization of French university, which is bullshit. But if there is an Americanization of French politics, it is that one. It's Macron importing from the US-style culture wars. That's what he's been doing with the support of members of his government. Why? Because the shift to the right, he wants really to hijack, also neutralize part of this right-wing electorate, which might be tempted to support Le Pen. So he believes, I think he plays with fire by doing that, but he believes by doing that, adopting a very right-wing stand on cultural issues, laïcité, Republican values, law and order policies and laws, that is going to capture this electorate. He's playing with fire, but then that's a strategy. And that's why the notion of race is coming up now very strongly, because all those chat shows on the right-wing media and other US imports. There's a French Fox News in France called CNews. There are also other TV channels which are not doing much better, but this is typical, another US import. So he's doing that, and of course, those on the TV chat shows, you have constantly, through the notions of laicity, republicanism, Republican values, Frenchness, what you name it, talks about racism, and in fact, very racist discourse, disguised in this sort of Republican thing. And that's why, people who are on the receiving end of those racist attacks have been defending themselves, and rightly so. That's why the discussion on race is coming. But I think it's coming, and I will leave it there for the time being. It's coming, I think, in very, very bad conditions, because it doesn't bring about, if you like, a proper pedagogical, calm discussion on race. It's always those attacks coming from the right and the far right, and Macron helping it, supporting that, and the left, but not a united left, because there's lots of problems on the left. If you look, for instance, on the discussion on Islamo-leftism, not the whole left defended academics. If you look at the discussion on safe space discussion groups, it's not the whole left which defended the student trade union UNEF against those attacks. So this is where we are. It's a bit of a mess, but in the meantime, at last, we're discussing race.
Thank you so much, Philippe. Very clear. For reasons of time, I'm going to slightly condense the US question, which those of you commenting on the US have already received. I'll just give it to you in short form. The main idea behind this question was to ask you, how do you see the emerging US left, roughly since the first Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016? How do you see the left faring with questions of race? It was widely commented on for a while maliciously by some that this emerging left was mostly a white thing, perhaps even mostly a white male thing, which I don't think was ever the case. But it's also true that the US left is still not quite seen as a diverse rainbow of forces, although it may be going in that direction. I won't embroider any more than that. I just wanted to ask both Nichole and Asad how you see that going. What's your assessment up to now? Camille, you've already presented Nichole's main credentials here. I just want to greet a fellow citizen of Massachusetts from the other side of the state, and welcome, and we're most interested to hear you. All yours.
Hey, thank you. So yeah, the movement it's definitely going, but we have a long way to go. And I think, hearing what Philippe said and Danièle have, said, many of these things, cross over. And I know that that's the third question, but just, speaking about our society and how there is this movement, of nationalism, as we refer to it in the US, and how everybody needs to adhere to this melting pot is one analogy that we use, versus the salad that many on the left like to refer to. But before now, the movement has been, really led by older white men. And this is a difficulty that, I've had myself. Previously, I was one of the first co-chairs for Our Revolution Massachusetts, which was an organization that sprouted off from the Bernie Sanders campaign the first time he ran against, Hillary Clinton in the primaries. Unfortunately, we know what happened. But
48%.
I know, right? But even in that space, it was, and whether it was realized or not, or intentional or not, there was constant disrespect even by members of the left who were older white men. They just didn't have the patience to hear from a different perspective. And so my point of view really is a little less academic, but someone who's more boots on the ground, who comes from a working class background and an immigrant background. My grandparents came here, my great grandparents, excuse me, came here from Sicily, from Sicilia. And so part of this journey as far as race in the US, I recently read a book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson, I believe. And it talks about this caste system within the US that's been built upon race. And it was very eye-opening to see how much of our society has been built around this racist system and how it reinforces itself. How newcomers, they come here and they immediately realize that based on the tone of your skin is where you're going to fall within the hierarchy of the system, and how it's been weaponized against those on the lower rungs, because the coin of acceptance is always that you must put down those who are lower than yourself. And as long as you buy into this and reinforce that system, then you'll be accepted. And we see it all around us. When my mom raised me on stories of my grandfather. I'm his namesake, Domenico, Nico. He was a union steward for the Steelworkers Union. He let people into his home. He helped so many new immigrant families. And in fact, many people attended his funeral because he had helped so many people. He was a very generous and giving man. But come to today, where my mom voted for Trump, my uncles voted for Trump, my aunts, they all voted for Trump. Why is that? Because over the generations, that system has been reinforced. And this is the background that I came from. So, I understand that viewpoint, and I've actually had somewhat of a journey to understand, how this has happened. I come from that background, and I'm still on my journey of learning and understanding and accepting, but it's there. And I hope in the future that will be a strength to be able to help bridge that gap. But being a woman coming from any type of marginalized community, it's rough. I was the first hijabi, to my knowledge, to run in the state of Massachusetts, the first Muslim to run for a position on Beacon Hill. We still have yet to have a Muslim hold a state office here in Massachusetts. And so, it's difficult. And I think, the left needs to realize as well that we need to come together. And the reason for this is when you're trying to support someone from a marginalized community, the left, we tend to fracture against ourselves at time. Are you left enough? Are you cultural enough? Are you POC enough? I don't believe it's conscious, but we're always, trying to out-left each other. And we forget that, part of who we are, part of our movement is to not have that melting pot, but to be able to accept each other's differences. That's where our strengths are. If we're all the same, we're never going to progress and learn to have different viewpoints. So really, I think, I don't know how to explain, I guess. For me, it's a little more personal. I'm one of the people within our community who, you know, I go into the mosque and I provide, you know, civic engagement workshops. And people don't understand the barriers that not just for my community, but other marginalized communities have. There's a heavy Haitian presence in my area as well, and I've been branching out into that community. But people don't realize that there is a lack of even basic understanding of our form of government, of how to engage with it, and how to take back our power, and how to work together as a community. And when others within the left movement, and this is true, this has happened, look at the scarf on my head and say, I can't be a true leftist because my religion dictates that I'm not an ally of the LGBTQ community, despite the fact that I am and have actively engaged as such. Or to say that because of the scarf on my head and my faith that it represents, that I won't fight for women's rights. I can't express how aggravating it is as a woman, you know, that other, you know, feminists, that other women don't fight for my right to wear a scarf on my head. But they don't think of it in those terms. They think of, you know, they want liberation for their bodies and to be able to wear what they want to wear. And I'm fine with that. But what about me wearing what I want to wear? Or other women? I hear the stories coming out of France and my heart breaks because I know what it feels like. To me, it's not just a piece of cloth. It represents a part of my identity. And to have that ripped away, I can't express it. There's so many different things that go on within the structure and within our society. And I think first and foremost, the biggest piece that the left needs to tackle is acceptance within our own ranks, and to be, you know, welcoming and accepting of different viewpoints, different cultures, different identities, and realize that we're all working for the same things. We just express them differently. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We'll pass the mic right on to Asad to follow up and continue the discussion on the United States essentially, or if you'd like to range further than the US, welcome to do that as well.
Yes, I think I'll start internationally and narrow in on the US, because I think so these are matters that we want to think about historically, and we want to think about at the level of politics, and not just at the level of a particular region or a particular set of borders. And I think that one thing that is certainly forgotten in the United States, and also forgotten in Europe, though that was not always the case, is the extent to which, like we can say, socialism, communism, Marxism was an entirely international phenomenon for the 20th century, for the whole 20th century. And if this were not the case, if it were not taken up in the revolutions of Asia and Africa and Latin America and the decolonization struggles and so on, Marxism would have remained a fairly idiosyncratic theory associated with a mediocre German socialist party at the end of the 19th century. If that had not happened, we would not be speaking about it as a historical force that it really was for the 20th century. And that's very important, and we need to study the contributions that were made by the people engaged in the wars of national liberation, the people who were revolutionaries outside of Europe that made major contributions to Marxist theory and made it into a universal phenomenon. So for me, this is a very important thing to remember, and it's something that is very much suppressed in the discussion in the United States, partly because we did not really ever have a robust socialist communist tradition here. We certainly didn't have a great tradition of Marxist theory. France is very different. And so there are different there are different kinds of elements to the discourse. So in the United States, we can't really refer back to to major organizations that we can't even refer now really to organizations that have some prospects of electoral success on the scale that has happened before in Europe. And I think this is a major limitation for us in the United States. So we have this phenomenon, which it's in some cases, as I listen, I feel almost as though we're often dealing with some opposite problems. That whereas in France, there is this the laïcité, the republicanism, the idea of a French national identity is something that, as Philippe was saying, causes illiteracy about race. Though I would imagine that there are still, I mean, you had a tradition of anti-colonial thinking that did make its mark in France at one time. I think that in the United States, the problem we have has been that people talk about issues that are related to racism. They talk about issues related to gender and sexuality, but these are seen as in a separate compartment. They are separated out from issues of class struggle, exploitation, capitalism. And it was very difficult to talk about class struggle or socialism in the United States for a very long time, precisely because the organizations that could have been the equivalent of the mass parties in Europe or of the labor movement in Europe were totally destroyed. They were destroyed by violence from the beginning of the 20th century, and then they were destroyed by McCarthyism and Cold War repression. And so that has made it so that the position of class struggle, of an opposition to capitalism, was for a very long time much more difficult to access. And so these two sort of directions emerged in which you were concerned about issues of racial and sexual domination, inequality, and so on, but to be concerned with class struggle, to be concerned with socialism, meant that you were adopting the politics of white men. And this, what I find, as I was saying at the beginning, what I find so offensive about this is precisely that, as I said, I think that the major contributions to the class struggle and to the understanding of global capitalism and to the universal political project of overturning capitalism was not the project of white men first and foremost. It was the project of untold numbers of people across the world who were not white, not European, who were not all male, and those people end up erased from history. And that's, I think, a great loss, and it's a great it's a travesty of history, and we have to keep that legacy alive, all of us who are engaged in politics of this kind. And so, there's certainly a response. I mean, because of this weakness of the left in the US, I think those who want to revive it are frequently engaged in trying to come up with an alternative to identity politics that will be able to overcome some of the feelings of mistrust or feelings of isolation from other populations and so on that happen when you have predominantly white male organizations. And so sometimes you'll get arguments that, well, look, we all have the same class interests, and so in the end, that's sufficient. And if we talk so much about race, we're not going to understand that Black people or immigrants or whatever other group you want to identify their main problems are class problems, and if we deal with class, we will deal with those. It's certainly true that if you don't deal with class, you will not deal with most of the problems that working people of all different, who identify in all different ways will encounter. But this, I don't think, is a sufficient way of understanding politics or understanding the basis for political unity, because we don't already have some kind of objective set of interests that have to do with our human nature or something like that. You can't just say, well, we all need to eat, so we'll all be concerned with our wages. Because people have many different things that they're concerned about on a day-to-day basis. Some people are concerned, as we know from looking at elections and so on, people are concerned with national identity, people are concerned with religion. These are things that are important in people's consciousnesses. And you can't just talk to them and convince them, okay, well, the really important thing is class, so you have to think about that. The way that I think that a unity can be achieved is through struggles that go beyond what we already have and what we are already constrained to do and think within the existing politics. We have to remember this precious legacy of revolutionary struggle, which was international and universal. And we have to defend the idea that that can happen again, that we can have that position today, and that we can go beyond what we already have, and even go beyond who we already are. Because, you know, I think that one of the things that, one of the issues with the term identity politics and with the term identity itself, it's not only that everybody who uses these terms means something different by them, but also that, you know, identity brings us to ideas of sameness and belonging. And I think that one of the important things for us to do is to say that, you know, Stuart Hall has a line that I can never be identical with myself. There's always some difference that is already in me, even as I consider myself in terms of sameness. I think we have to prevent from happening, because it has to be possible for people to be heterogeneous, for people to be many things, and that we have to recognize that and build a politics not on gaining recognition for some aspect of our group belonging, which will always be an effacity. It has to be based on affirmatively stating a new politics, a politics that goes beyond what exists, which is about the which is oriented towards the reorganization of society on a completely egalitarian and self-governing basis. And I think that when you don't have that, you are unable to deal with any of the problems that we encounter surrounding these issues. I'll leave it at that.
We can move now. It's now just a little bit past the hour, and we have just roughly a half an hour to go, and we'd like to encourage as much participation as possible. I saw earlier that, there are a couple of questions that have started to reach us here, and I'm going to try and see if I can play on two screens at once. Or Camille, are you catching the two screen effect better than I am? Can you see the questions popping up at you? I have one which came in earlier, which is a rather general one, I would say, and it's how best do you reckon we can reconcile the strands of the left behind our common goals and not fall into the trap of being divided, while still acknowledging the richness that diversity brings? I think that's almost a word for word what Asad was just telling us. But the question asks how. Now, what else do we have? I'm looking for other questions between two different boxes here. How, I'd like to know Asad's thoughts on how to prevent in-grouping, out-grouping. There's another question. We're gonna take 4 or 5 of these, and you can. What else do we have? Camille, are you following this better than I am? Please go for it.
Yeah, so we have one question which is specifically directed at Nichole, who would like to know what's your experience been regarding identity as a member of DSA in Massachusetts? And how can DSA make inroads with groups that may not feel represented by its rank and file to broaden its impact? That's a specific question.
Do you want me to go ahead, or did you want to say more?
Do we have, let's see if there are a couple of others that are coming into us here. Do you see others popping up?
Yeah, we also have,
yes.
I think one that we could maybe start with, because it ties into what Asad has been speaking of, and I think also ties in well to Philippe's discussion of the sort of illiteracy of in France with regards to race, and Danièle Obono, who brought up the this erasure of the work of non-white leftist politics, which I think is correlates very well to what Asad has been speaking about, and sort of wondering by what processes does this happen? How can we combat it? And how to apply Asad's excellent points to this French situation?
Could we go back? Is that enough questions for now? Could we go back around in the same order as before and ask each of you to come in as you see fit? Starting perhaps with Danièle Obono.
Okay. I'm shorter this time, but also to react to what other speakers said, because I think it's very interesting and very enlightening. So maybe the question I've read out best: can we reconcile the strength of the left beyond our common goals and not fall in the trap of being divided? I mean, that's the $1 million question. How do we? I mean, that's a question, as I said, that has been asked over centuries of, working class struggle and emancipation struggle. So for me, it's important to realize the specificity of those questions, because it means something real concrete for the people who are targeted by racism and oppression, but also to think about it as some strategical question, because racism impacts everybody, but for us on the left, this is about how do we unite the class, how do we unite the people in order to, win over the majority and be majoritarian. So it's not just of the side. I think it's very important. And also when we think about identity politics, there's been a lot of talk about it, I think, in the US and also here in some ways. To me, I think the problem with identity politics, it's not identity, it's politics. It's really politics. How is it used? How is it weaponized? How is it today, as Philippe said, and how is it used as a weapon in the cultural war that the right and the far right is waging against us? And how do we respond to this? Is it are we on the defense and saying that, oh no, we're not communitarists, or we're not this and we're not that, which is a way to deny our diversity, our multicultural, our existence. I mean, when I say our, I mean the existence of people of color and the existence of their identities and the identity of people of color. Or are we tackling the very issue of racism even within our own ranks? Because I think it's also something that is weakening us, and that makes it difficult for us to be on the offensive on this issue, because race is the structural framework of our society. And it means that within the left, race plays a factor of also dividing us with a hierarchy of power, because that's also the problem. The thing that the left needs to check its own privilege, whether it's race or gender also, because I think it's important to remind that it's not a done deal, like we're talking about race, but like it's all over the oppression are okay. I mean we overcome all of the oppression. That's not true. What we witnessed in France is also a backlash against, feminist fights, and when you're fighting about sexual assault issues and stuff like that, you realize how deeply rooted sexism and violence against women are within the society and even within our own space. So it's an ongoing battle within the left to acknowledge our diverse identities and not use it as a dividing factor, but a uniting factor, because those identities make us, more aware of different point of view or different experiences. So it's a strength rather a weakness, and we have to be on the offensive of that. Check our own privilege within our, works, and the fact that, as I think Nichole said, that being the only Jabi ever, being a candidate or ever elected, and it's happening everywhere. I mean, as I said, I've been the lone Black women for a long time, and I'm still one of the few leading Black women on the left. And I'm only known because I've been targeted for being Black and, and being radical and, and not. So I think that's the fight, not shrink, and not be on the defense, but being proud of that. And so we have to check our own privilege. We have to learn about our own history and stop erasing the history of the people before, of the people of color, of the oppressed people, and also to not shy away from the cultural war. I mean, to also be on the offensive ideologically, and to rebuild and to own. As I said, I'm just going to stop here because I think it's very important. France, we've been attacked for, importing US IDs within French framework, as if that was something like shameful, as if our own history on the left wasn't made of importation from all over the world. And
by the way, one of those American imports was France Fanon. I mean,
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, that's what the international working class movement being built. I mean, you talk about Fanon, I could talk about Marx, which was not very French, it was very German, and we imported Marxism from there. And you talk about it, so it's not something that we should be ashamed of. It's part of, our history as the left, and we should be proud. I mean, to learn from each other, to learn from each other. So I think that's part of the thing that, be on the offensive, check our own privilege within our spaces, and dismantle within our own spaces, the hierarchy, and the fact that those are still movements that are led by mostly white people, mostly male, and that needs to change also. If we want not just to be pleased with ourselves and see, see how diverse our platform is, but because the objective is to unify the people, and to unify the people, you have to reach out to them about what they live and what they feel and what makes them want to stand up and fight, and usually what makes them to want to stand up, it what affect them directly. So that's the objective, is to the end goal is to unify our class, to unify the people. It doesn't mean erase the differences, but build on those identities, social, economical, cultural identities, and to focus them around common goal, and to write together, and also to build together, and not just build on behalf of the people, but to really build together those goals we want to achieve. I'll stop that.
Okay. Keeping the order before, we now turn to Philippe, who may even want to follow up on what was just said by Députée Obono, or in response to some of the questions that you heard.
That's fine by me. Thanks, Jim. Very briefly, because we're coming to an end, to the end of this conference. I'd like to add a point about, and that would sort of, for the American friends here, probably would be helpful to understand the differences between a sort of American racism and French racism and the way one discusses race in turn. I think French racism comes largely from French colonial past, and a French colonial past which was never really debated, discussed, acknowledged as such, or at least if it was acknowledged, of course, France colonized, but there's still in France today, in some conservative and less conservative quarters, this idea that France brought its civilization, so to speak, to the rest of the world. It colonized, and it did good by doing that. Also, to get back to my pet topic on republicanism and why it's become a toxic notion, think of Algeria and colonization of Algeria and the independence of Algeria in 1962 after a long bloody war. In Algeria, all people living there were granted French nationality, including, of course, the indigenous population. However, in practice, they were second-class citizens, didn't have the same rights as the French from France. They didn't have certain economic and civic rights. So it's in the name of republicanism that France colonized, and its values, it colonized other countries. So why it is a problem now? Because it's become a problem since you had after in the 1950s, 60s, you know, the 30 glorious years of economic boom, mass immigration, particularly from the former colonies in Maghreb. And initially it was a type of immigration where it was the lone workers, male, coming to France for a while, making some savings, money, and going back home after a while. It all stopped from the mid-1970s when a law allowed the regrouping of families, i.e. women who had stayed at home and their children could come and rejoin the husband. And living in France permanently, they in turn had children who, born on French soil, became French citizens. And the whole issue of Islam, being a Muslim in France and what it entails, and the acceptability of it, whether it is French or not acceptable, it came, you know, afterward. Until then, being Islam and being a Muslim, as long as it was foreign workers living in France for a few years, was never a problem. It became a problem afterward when it concerned French citizens, but that issue, of course, is never openly discussed. So see, a lot of the racism going on in French society goes through this French colonial past, never acknowledged, never really debated, and for some still seen as a positive development. The point about the trade union UNEF, I think I got a question from one of the participants here, and whether it is compatible with French universal values. Of course it is, in my view. Of course we need to define what we mean by universalism, because it could mean like republicanism or laicite, so many different things depending on who uses those notions. But I don't see any incompatibility between claiming, you know, that there are something called universal values, you know, like which would apply to every citizen, and while at the same time upholding, you know, this idea that we are diverse, we're different, and one need to respect that difference and also make provisions in order to respect cultural, religious, ethnic difference, whatever. The question of UNEF is, I think, highly hypocritical, because back in the 1960s, when you had the first feminist movement, they all used those safe space discussion groups. But at the time and after that, it was never an issue. Why? Because most of these French feminists were white middle-class women. No problem then. One understood that they should probably discuss together issues without, you know, having some men coming in and trying to hijack the conversation. It is only becoming a problem today in France when those discussion groups concerns racialized people, as the French call them, i.e. members from ethnic minorities who turn out to be victims of racism. And it's almost like there's so much bad faith in those debates, so much bad faith in the end, because it's not about universalism, it's just simply people don't want those groups to meet, because they don't want those people to get together and propose you know, a sort of a response to the growing racism in French society, which would be a way. So I think that's really purely political tactics in order to break down an anti-racist movement, which is, there's been a revival in French society of it lately. You know, it was really, the anti-racist movement was, for some reason I don't have any time to get into now, was broken. It has been really coming back strongly, and I think the assassination of George Floyd also internationally played a role in relaunching. But there are also lots of issues, notably police brutality against members of ethnic minorities, the killing of some similar issues as George Floyd in the US. It happens, as you know, also in France. So I think that's my answer to those. It's purely hypocritical. It's a way, really, with a lot of bad faith, to oppose the sort of the formation of a proper anti-racist movement in France.
Okay, we're actually making the rounds here, and if there was a question or two directed to Nichole herself, so I'll go ahead. I'd be interested to hear in the process what it's like to campaign as a candidate in Massachusetts, given all that you said before about stigmatization that you encounter. All right.
Thank you. I'll try and answer as much as I can, as briefly as I can. So just to put all of you on your toes, I'm really going to challenge some of you right now. And I know part of what I'm going to say is most likely going to trigger some people. But here's what I have to say. You know, we get to this question of how we can be more united as a left, first and foremost. But I think the first step to that is understanding our own preconceptions and our own biases that uphold the system. And when I spoke about the book that I read earlier, it was very eye-opening, and I encourage everybody to read it because it speaks on a global dynamic. It talks about colonialism. It talks about the otherization of certain groups, the in-group, the out-group. But you know, I'm gonna give you a scenario. I don't remember which country it was, but I do remember that there was a Muslim woman, and part of her immigration status was contingent upon her being able to shake a man's hand or to take her scarf off. But now you're asking her to accept an unwanted touch. We hear about the Me Too movement and we hear about rape culture, but how many of you, when I tell you this is almost the equivalent of rape, what does that make you feel? Do you think it's no big deal that she's been asked to accept the touch of a man that she doesn't want? Have you even thought about it in those terms? What do you think about, you know, a woman being asked to take her scarf off? Do you think it's no big deal? Do you think that, you know, wearing a scarf somehow means that I'm subjugated or less than? What if I told you that I chose to wear the scarf? I'm a convert to Islam, but I didn't convert because of my husband. So many people ask me that question. So I speak from obviously an Islamic perspective, a Muslim perspective, but how many other cultures out there that we force our system and our opinions upon and not even realize it? So I talked earlier about how the coin of acceptance within our society, within this caste system, is about putting down those who are below us, about becoming a part of that cycle of victimization and abuse. We see this within broken homes and families. You know, with, you know, here in the US, we're dealing with an opioid epidemic, and it's caused a lot of broken homes. So this isn't something that's new. We know what this cycle is. So how do we break free of that? You know, here in my area in Medford, one of the local school committee decided to change the name of an elementary school from Christopher Columbus. I hope many are familiar with the controversy and the past, the brutal past of Christopher Columbus. But how many don't know that here in the US, Italian Americans were not accepted, that in fact, Sicilians, which subgroup I'm part of, in Alabama, there was a court ruling because here in the US, up to a certain period of time, Blacks and whites were not allowed to intermarry. And so when a white presenting Sicilian man married a Black woman, there was a big controversy. And the courts of Alabama then decided that Sicilians did not count as white and therefore could marry Black people, that this was not an interracial marriage. I mention this because you have to understand that here in the US, the hardships that Black people and African Americans have gone through because of the color of their skin, how they were put down, and how they are literally the bottom rung of this caste system. And so what, if you were at the very bottom, what would you do to be able to pull out of that? Well, for Italian Americans, they latched on to the story of Christopher Columbus. That was their coin of acceptance. And yes, his past is very brutal. He raped, he murdered, and committed genocide. But he did it against the low class, those who weren't accepted as part of society. I hope you see where I'm going with this, because it's very symbolic of, you know, what's happened within my own immigrant community. Now they're very accepted. And they're accepted because a big part of that is because of Christopher Columbus. So now people are trying to rip that away. Now we all see this as, yes, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to tackle this, and we get into this battle mentality. But do we understand the trauma that we're trying to tackle? Do we understand the trauma that we ourselves could be inflicting because we believe that our opinion is superior? And I'm not saying that it's not. Don't get me wrong. I despise this history. But coming from the roots that I come from, I do understand the psychological impact, the emotional impact that it has. And so first and foremost, we do need to tackle our own biases. We have to admit that there's a problem. Next, we really need to begin to have more compassion for each other and realize that not everything is a battle or everything is what it seems. So, and I believe that this can come from my own example of running for office here in the US, here in Massachusetts. You know, Massachusetts is seen as this kind of blue progressive bastion, this paradise. It's not. Part of why I joined the Democratic State Committee is that we have too many Republicans running as Democrats. Too many. And what does that mean for someone like myself who's running as a Democrat? When I ran for state representative, I took on an older white man who's been in just this position for going on 20 years now, has been in public office since before I was born, second assistant majority leader, voted against the right of equal marriage, votes consistently against women's reproductive rights. So did I get any support from my own party? I was in a primary, no. Did he get support from our Republican governor? Oh, you bet he did. And I had to tackle my own community too, as well, because they don't understand what it is to accept the rights of others, but not compromise our own faith. That's an interesting dynamic too, to be able to appease my own community and say, yes, I have your back and I will fight for your rights, but also go to the progressive community, other marginalized communities, the Haitian Americans, the Italian Americans, the LGBTQ plus community, and say, you know what, I'm going to have your back too. But somehow we always view those interests as conflicting with each other. when they're not. My rights end where your rights begin. And so I see I got the 1 minute marker here. I apologize. This is, you know, a subject that I'm very passionate about. But I believe there's room in the movement for everybody. And we need to address our own egos and kick them to the side and realize it's not just about us. There are other experiences and other traumas that people have been subjected to. And if I can't move my own BS to the side and realize the trauma I could be inflicting on others, although unknowingly, or not acknowledging the trauma that has already been done, then we can't move forward. If we're constantly battling each other and saying, I'm more left than you, I'm more, you know, POC, or I'm more this, it's not going to work. So check your ego at the door. Have a little compassion and meet people where they're at. Because I guarantee you, if you do that, then you'll be able to bring them over a little bit. Thanks.
Thank you. I've heard various people having taken part in recent DSA campaigns or DSA sponsored campaigns, and I hear that message from a lot of candidates, how important it is to be there, knock on doors, talk to people, meet them where they're at. Indeed, thank you so much. Asad, you get to clean up here. There were a few questions that came around that may have interested you. There was one that asked how your way of thinking applies to the French situation. Maybe we won't burden you with that one unless you want to give it a shot. And also, I was also interested, just in passing, there are a few questions here that have to do with a colonial or decolonial reading of history, and we wonder where you fall in on those debates about the interest that there is in uncovering the colonial roots of the contemporary society. That's a big one, of course, it's a giant one, but
well, I mean, I think I feel I have to say that I think that it's very important to deal with the history of colonialism. It's very important to deal with the history of the genocide of the indigenous people of the land that's now the United States. And so I think that if we talk about Columbus Day, we have to talk about that. I mean, I don't think that we can just base our conclusions on our personal experiences and identities. I mean, it's not my I mean, I don't have an indigenous background, but I think I have a responsibility to call attention to the fact that this land is the United States because of an attempted extermination of the indigenous population. I think that's very important. So I just feel like I have to say that. And I think there's also this point about white ethnics, let's say, as they used to say in kind of archaic vocabulary. There is a discourse now about white privilege and about whiteness and white fragility and all of these things. And it all takes whiteness for granted as something that is just, you know, to put it in the most provocative way, it makes the mistake of thinking there's such a thing as white people. There's really no such thing as white people, in the sense that white is a category that was constructed over a long period in order to first of all differentiate different kinds of laborers, and then to compose a group out of migrants from Europe, from many different places, who had many different cultural backgrounds, different languages, and in fact were in hierarchies in Europe that were understood in other ways. So certainly Southern Italians, certainly the Irish, and so on, were groups that were rendered who were dominated in Europe and who were spoke of as subhuman. But when they came to the United States, you had a nation that was defining itself on whiteness, and you had processes by which these people became white. And that's the great argument of Noel Ignatieff and Ted Allen and the magazine Race Trader was, you have to explain to people that you have to get rid of your whiteness. You have to start to recognize that this is a fictive construct that has been placed on you, and that if you want to have any kind of improvement in your condition, if you want to see higher wages, if you want to see better working conditions, then you have to start to get rid of your own whiteness. And it's not just because I want you to feel bad about yourself for being white. It's because I want you to recognize that there's no such thing as a white person, and that we need to be together for both of our interests, not just for you to recognize mine. And so I think that in that sense, our experiences are a very tricky thing, because if our politics are about our experiences, everybody has a different experience, and everybody is going to have a different way of representing that to themselves. And of course that's not going away. We're always going to have this, but there has to be something beyond that. Otherwise, we'll all only be talking about what's in our own immediate interest and that is legible to us in our own immediate experience. And that's not enough for politics, because you need to have something that is beyond you. We need to have something that's beyond. I need to go beyond myself and be able to join with others, not because of all of us recognizing our diversity or respecting each other's experience, but because we have a commitment to an entirely different kind of world, a commitment to overturning this world that exists. I think that's the basis of unity, and that's there is nothing else that can constitute a real political unity until we make that commitment and say that that commitment has been made in the past by all kinds of people in all kinds of places, and the thing that unites them is this commitment, and that's something that we have to be faithful to.
I couldn't imagine a better finale. It's going to have to be that, because it's now 8:37. We've gone a little bit over time. We can't begin to thank all of you enough for being with us tonight. This has been a great event for us. Thank you to Camille. Thank you to Flo and Max and all the people giving us support in the background here. Our group is moving ahead, and this event is a landmark among others. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch with you, and we hope to do these things on a regular basis. So good evening or good afternoon, as the case may be, and catch you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.